Assalamu alaikum everyone. Now all of you know what Assalamu alaikum means. Thanks, Shukran. So I won't have to translate for you. So the topic of today's talk is regarding the oneness of God, which in Arabic we refer to as tawheed. And this is, of course, monotheism is not something that's specific to the Islamic faith. We know other Abrahamic faiths like Judaism, Christianity, have a deeply entrenched monotheism, although they may express it differently than how the Islamic faith does. Monotheism is essentially the fundamental message of the Islamic faith. And when you look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, what you find is that his life was divided into roughly two stages that historians identify. One is a stage of his life in Mecca, and one is a stage of his life in Medina, in the city of Medina. The Meccan period was a period that lasted about a decade. And the core message in the Meccan period was about this idea of tawheed, about the oneness of God, about calling the community towards worship of one God. We know Arabia was a polytheistic society where you had idol worship. And so for the first decade of his life, the Prophet called people towards this particular belief. And when you look at the verses of the Quran, this is pretty much clear. Islamic law, the legal aspects of Islam, only came about largely in the Medinian period. So the Prophet really stressed upon this core theological point of belief for a decade of his life before he transitioned into a period where the laws of Islam, laws relating to prayer and charity and fasting and marriage and divorce and inheritance and all these legal topics were articulated. And so Muslims believe that this was something that was carried upon by or conveyed by all the messengers. From Adam to Abraham to Solomon to David to Moses to Jesus, all the prophets that preceded the Prophet Muhammad, their core message was the same essential message of Tawheed, or the oneness of God. And so there are numerous verses in the Quran that explicitly mention this particular point. And so the way I'm going to divide this talk is, it's going to be basically two parts. One is going to be the actual theology, which can be very dry, and some can be boring, as theology tends to be. And the other is a more spiritual side of Tawheed, which I find to be the more life-giving, I don't want to say exciting, but it's a side that really allows you to connect to the message, and for that message to have a transformative effect on the human in his practical life. And so from a theological perspective, the way they define the oneness of God, and I'll just say it in Arabic, they'll say استفراد المعبود بالعبادة مع الاعتقاد وحدته الذات والصفات والأفعال, which means that singling out the one who is worshipped for worship, while believing or attesting to his oneness, the oneness of his essence, his attributes, and his actions. And so the Muslim conception of God is that God is an essence, because, rationally speaking, an essence is something that makes something what it is. So God is an essence who has particular attributes, and those attributes are manifested, at least to us, through his actions. His actions of creating things, of taking things out of existence, and so forth. And so the Muslim, from a creedal perspective, Muslims affirm the oneness of God in all three of these particular aspects. God is one in his essence, and what that means is there is no one whose essence is like God's essence. And it also means that God's essence is not divided into parts. God is not composed of parts. And the rational argument for that is that being divided into parts is an attribute of created things. It's an attribute of contingent things. I have a hand, I have a face, I have legs, and me as an entity, I'm reliant on these parts of my body, and this is indicative of my contingent nature. Whereas God does not have parts on which He relies upon in this manner. The same thing applies to God's attributes, which we call sifat. That there is no one who has the attributes of God. Muslims believe God is powerful, God has will, God is someone who has knowledge. These are all the attributes of God, and so no one possesses these attributes as God possesses them. Obviously, in our own way, we all have the attribute of power, we all have the attribute of will, we all have the attribute of knowledge, we have the attribute of speech and hearing and all these other attributes. But our attributes are contingent, they're ephemeral, they're temporal, whereas God's attributes are eternal, they are non-ephemeral, and they are permanent. So no one has attributes like God's attributes. And at the same time, again, God's attributes are not subject to division. And then God's actions, again, the same thing applies, that God is one in His actions, meaning no one's actions are like God's actions. Because again, God creates in pre-eternality, whereas we are confined within time and space, and our actions have a beginning, they have an end, and so forth. And so this is the core sort of manner in which Muslim theologians construct this idea of Tawheed, right? They say Tawheed applies to singling out God for worship and Him being worshipped alone, and then affirming certain things in respect to the person of God in relation to His essence and His attributes and His actions. And Muslim scholars have obviously presented a number of theological arguments, largely rational arguments, for why this is the case. Firstly, for why God exists in the first place, and then why His oneness is something that's essential to Him, insofar as He's God. And I'm not going to get into the rational proofs because that can that's a whole lecture on itself. But we know that one of the core rational proofs that theologians mention is what would be the consequence of having a multitude of gods, because God is defined in a specific manner. He's omnipotent. He has knowledge. He's not confined by anyone else's will. He's not confined by anyone else's power. And so if you have two omnipotent beings, then rationally that leads to certain absurdities in terms of our understanding of God. Meaning, do they need each other's consent to create? Can they do it on their own? Are they mutually involved in the aspect of creation, and so on and so forth? And so the scholars discuss this, and I won't get into details because I don't want to spend too much time on the dry theological aspect of Tawheed. But it is important. It's important because in the Muslim tradition, what differentiates a Muslim from a non-Muslim is precisely this particular affirmation of the oneness of God. And so we know that La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God, is one half of the testimony of faith that a person is required to utter when he wants to enter into the Muslim faith. And we know that there are numerous Quranic verses, and there are numerous traditions of the Prophet that connect salvation in the next life to this particular belief. And so the Prophet, he himself said that whoever says La ilaha illallah, that there's no God, capital G, other than, there's no God, small g, other than God, capital G, then paradise is made incumbent upon that particular individual. And so this is the fundamental thing that differentiates between a Muslim and a non-Muslim. And this is not to say that someone who doesn't affirm Tawheed is necessarily doomed to wherever he's meant to go in the next life, because the question of salvation is a separate question that I won't get into, but you can ask later on. But what we do know is whoever affirms this goes to heaven. Whoever doesn't affirm it, then his fate is consigned to God. If God wills him into paradise, he can go to paradise. If God wills him somewhere else, then that's where he'll end up. And so this is the core theological tradition of Islam, a tradition that was carried upon, according to the Muslims, by all the previous prophets. And if you have any question about theology, you can ask me in the Q&A session. But I really want to get to some of the more spiritual aspects, because I think that theologically, when you discuss things with people, things like essence, attributes, actions, for most Muslims, so he's like, okay, I believe in one God. I don't need to know about this essence and attribute stuff. That's a more technical approach to the oneness of God. And I'm only mentioning it because I want people to understand how theologians formulated their conception of God himself. Now, from a spiritual perspective, Tawheed is an inexplicable reality. It is unfathomable. It is not something that can be grasped by creation. It is not something that the mind can properly conceive. It is not something that the human can properly understand. And when you look at, if you were to ask a spiritual, a scholar who specializes in Islamic spirituality, how would you define Tawheed? How would you define the oneness of God? He would likely not say anything, or he would attempt to say anything, but he would stress this point that it is not something that can be understood by the mind. Theology is a matter of the mind. Rational proofs are a matter of the mind. We construct things. When we construct a syllogism, everything that began, or everything everything that is created has a beginning. Everything that has a beginning has a creator. Therefore, when we do these things, it's an intellectual exercise. And what Islam is really getting at with Tawheed is not per se an intellectual exercise, even though that's step one. We know that the mind and rational argumentation and rational proofs have an important place within the Islamic tradition, but more importantly is how does this particular notion of oneness impact us on a practical level, and how does it transform us as humans and as people who submit to this particular deity. And so I'm just going to read something that one of the great spiritual giants of the Islamic tradition, how, when he was asked about the oneness of God, how he responded. And for most of you, you'll see that it's, in some sense, a bewildering sort of explanation that he gives. It doesn't really, it seems like there's no way out. There's no way to actually express it. So I'll just read what he said. It's a whole paragraph. So I'm just going to read it right now. His name is Ashibli, and he lived around I think the 10th century, so a long time ago. So this particular source says, someone asked Ashibli, tell us about pure oneness. Tell us about the Tawheed of God, with the tongue of exceptional truth. He was seen as a saint, as someone who had sainthood, and so they were asking him, from the perspective of your sainthood, from the perspective of your realization of God, your gnosis of God, describe to us this element, this aspect of Tawheed. And so he explained, whoever speaks about oneness by using ordinary expressions is a heretic. Whoever makes allusions to it is a dualist. Whoever points to it with a gesture is a worshipper of idols. Whoever utters it plainly is reckless. Whoever keeps silent about it is ignorant. Whoever fathoms that he has arrived at its realization is vain. Whoever thinks that he has come close to it is in fact far from it. Whoever thinks that he has found it in his ecstasy will lose it. And each time you think that you are able to discern its meaning by your imagination and intellect and attain its significance in the most perfect manner, it comes back to you rejected, temporal, and transient like yourselves. So his core message is simple. You are incapable of grasping the divine oneness, because the physical, the temporal, the fleeting, which Muslims believe is the whole cosmos, can never grasp something that is eternal and beyond time and space. And so Al-Junayd, who's another spiritual giant, what he said those who have attained the realization of the oneness of God have only attained bewilderment. Like that was the extent, the person who truly knows God and knows his oneness is the one who is most bewildered of all people. Because if you think about it, beyond just a mental, even as simply as a mental concept, when you think about a being who is beyond time and space, if you think about the concept of eternality, if you think about the concept of something being omnipotent, even these very simple notions, what does it mean to be beyond time and space? How we can't understand that. We have no point of reference in terms of understanding what it means for God to be beyond or outside of time and space. We cannot fathom how God can be eternal, because again, we have no point of reference. We're temporal beings. We haven't experienced that. But this bewilderment has a function in the Islamic tradition. It doesn't mean that you go up in the forest and just sit around and start crying and saying, "Oh my God, I can't. What is this? I'm just completely I have no understanding whatsoever of these things." Even though some people were probably driven mad thinking about it too much. But the purpose of oneness is meant to be, as I mentioned, it's meant to be transformative. And the transformative aspect of Tawheed can be on a number of levels. It can be, first of all, the very first aspect of transformation that occurs to anyone who realizes the oneness of God, as it should be realized, as theologically described, is the aspect of submission. That when you know there's this being, and he has these particular attributes, and there's no one whatsoever like him, and he's incomparable, then it is natural to submit to this being. And submission in the Islamic religion, that's what Islam is. That's literally the name of the religion, is submission. Islam means to submit. And so a true realization of Tawheed entails submission. And part of submission is worship. And so Muslims have their 5 daily prayers, we have our charity, we have our fasting. People often ask questions like, well, okay, why do women wear hijab? Why do Muslims, why don't they eat pork? Why do men grow their beards? Why do you circumambulate a brick house in the middle of a desert somewhere? They have these questions, and ultimately people can bring about wisdoms for these. Like, well, okay, I wear this scarf because it's modest. Okay, well, if the whole world started thinking that you look very, very attractive in the hijab, does that mean you're going to stop wearing it? So, wisdom is one thing, but the real reason why we do these acts is simply because God has commanded us. And because we feel that He is worthy of worship because of who He is. And when He commands us to do something, then we submit to it. And we understand that God has placed within the human being something. In the essence of the human being, there's something. In the soul of the human being, there's something that these particular acts of worship, my praying, my fasting, and even the way I dress, and the way I speak to my parents, and the way I deal with the poor, and everything I do that my religion commands of me, of the good, has an effect on my heart that polishes my heart and allows me to draw closer to God Himself. That is the ultimate aim of our worship, is this drawing closer to the divine. The Prophet during his lifetime, right before he moved to Medina, he had a profound spiritual experience, which we call the Mi'raj, which was an ascent to heaven. And so when he ascended to heaven, the Islamic narrative, what it says is that he reached a point where when he was being accompanied by Gabriel, he reached a point where Gabriel stopped and said, "I cannot go beyond this point. This point is just for you." And so he went beyond that point, and that's where he had his intimate experience with God. From an Islamic theological perspective, the only person who we believe has seen God whatever that means, whatever it means to see God, again, something we cannot fathom, is the Prophet himself. And what the Islamic spiritual tradition says is that every single individual has his own mi'raj, he has his own ascent to God, where through his worship and through his submission, he reaches a place where he has, where God discloses himself to this individual, where there's a divine gnosis that comes about within the soul of the individual, within the innermost self of the individual, that allows him to really understand what this bewilderment that we speak about in words is about. And so worship is the first sort of necessary thing that follows from the understanding of Tawheed. But it's not only worship, it's also sincere worship. And so when Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, a famous female, I don't know what the feminine for saint is, saintess? Is it the same word?
I think it's the same word.
Okay. Who's a famous female saint? When she was asked about, she was someone who was known to worship God. She would stress about worshiping God for God. She's like, don't worship God for heaven. Don't worship God out of fear for hellfire. Don't worship God because you think you're going to get a castle, a big castle in heaven, and eternal life. The only reason God has prescribed these things, the only reason He's mentioned these things in His book, is because the vast majority of people are not capable of realizing who He really is. And if they were to realize who He really is, and oneness is a core aspect of that, then they would worship God for God Himself. And so a famous saying of hers, when she was asked about this, she would say, Ajar thumma dar. When she was asked about heaven, she would say, look at the neighbor first, then look at your house. It's a very core Islamic teaching, about being good to your neighbors, honoring your neighbors, that a Muslim who's living in his house, safely, while his neighbor is home hungry, is not someone who's truly submitting to the faith. And so she did a play on words, and she said, look at the neighbor first, and then look at your own house. And what she was alluding to is that, okay, you're in heaven, but look at who's next to you in heaven, which is God. So focus on Him, then you can focus on these other, rewards that you might get. And so Tawheed entails worship and entails sincerity. And this is precisely what the Prophet meant when he was asked about Ihsan. In the famous hadith, it's called the hadith of Gabriel, where Gabriel came to the Prophet and he said, well, tell me about Islam, tell me about Iman, which is faith, and then tell me about Ihsan. So the Prophet replied, Iman is that you testify that there is one God, and that you perform your prayers, and you fast, and you give charity, and you perform the pilgrimage if you are able to. And he said, Iman is that you believe in God, His angels, His books, His messengers, and in divine decree. And then when Gabriel asked him what is Ihsan, the Prophet responded, it is that you worship God as if you see Him. And ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tarah. That you worship God as if you see Him. And this is in effect the sort of the pinnacle point of why we're doing our worship. To reach a stage where we're able to actually worship in a manner where we are in the presence of God Himself. And so Tawheed implies worship, it implies sincerity, and it also implies, and I have it over here, sorry I wasn't able to memorize all of it. And then the final thing that it implies is purification from everything other than God Himself. Because God is one, and so what essentially happens when the Prophet goes on the Mi'raj and he has his experience, his divine experience of God, and then he descends back down. And it's actually very instructive because the Prophet has this Mi'raj before the Medinan period. The Prophet has this Mi'raj, his ascent, before the Muslims actually organized as a community with laws and with a central mosque and everything. And what that actually shows us as an instructive point is that communities only arise out of, or effective, grounded communities only arise when people themselves, when individuals have a sense of they're personally rectified. And part of that is this realization of God and this realization of oneness. And so, the third aspect of oneness is this idea of purifying yourself from everything other than God Himself. And so, when we say God is one, from a spiritual perspective, what we're saying is everything that you see around you is a manifestation of God's attributes. Every single one of us, everything in the cosmos, everything that's created, manifests the power of God. It manifests the will of God. It manifests the knowledge of God. And we worship in order to reach a point where we can actively realize and see that manifestation of God's attributes. And it doesn't mean that God's indwelling in me or indwelling in you in a literal sense. But what it means is that there is a unity to creation. And so one of the definitions that a great scholar gave of Tawheed, he said Tawheed is the dropping of the mind. Or in Arabic it's called Iskatul Ya'at, or the dropping of the me. So he said there's no longer for me, or to me, or from me, or with me. Rather what it becomes is for God, and with God, and to God, and from God. That is the deeper idea of Tawheed. That is the more transformative inner meaning of Tawheed that people are meant to realize. Not something that's just in the mind, but something that people actually experience in their lives. People, when they step out the door and when they see the stars and they see the moon and they see the sun and they see their fellow humans and they see the trees and the rocks and they see everything around them, they have within their innermost self a realization that there is a divine unity to everything that is in the cosmos. And everything comes from God, and everything returns to God. And that is essentially the core element of Tawheed. And when that element of Tawheed is there, what is effectively happening is you're effacing yourself. You're ridding yourself of the attributes of humanity, and you're trying to inculcate in yourself, insofar as you realize that I too am a manifestation of God's power and God's will and God's knowledge. You're effacing your own, what they call your bashariyah, your humanity, and you're replacing it with something that's more pure, something that's more divine, and something that transforms your whole outlook in life. And I constantly mention this, and the reason for this is because religious people often have a sort of a dichotomous understanding of the world where it's religious or secular, where it's the spiritual and the mundane. These are common ways people, when they look at the world, that's how they phrase the compartments of the world. So when you go to a lot of people, even Muslims, and you say, well, okay, why are you studying engineering? Yeah, I would love to have gone to, and I've spoken to people, I would have loved to have gone to Syria and studied the great, became a hermit and spend my days and nights worshiping God, but one part of the cosmos, but a unity of everything. And so, when you study medicine, when classical Muslims study medicine, they very much saw it as a religious pursuit. Or when they study engineering, or when they study astronomy, or when they study any of the sciences that were not, quote unquote, strictly speaking, a religious science, they still saw it as endeavoring to understand the divine insofar as everything that we see in the cosmos points to Him. And so, apart from human beings, the Muslim understanding is everything that's around us is an ayah, it's a sign that indicates to God. And the Arabic word for the universe, or for the cosmos, is alam. And alam is the Arabic word for a signpost. Because the whole understanding is the whole universe, it points to something that is beyond it, that is greater than it, and that thing is God. And so this was the classical Muslim understanding. It was a unity of knowledge, it was a unity of purpose, it was a unity of being, to the extent that people no longer see things as being divided. They no longer see things as compartmentalized. The mind, that's how the mind thinks. The mind likes to compartmentalize things, but the spirit and the heart that is truly realized does away with these compartmentalizations. And for it, the true realization of Tawheed is this realization of a divine purpose, of a connection between everything that is within this particular realm. How much time do I have?
Still on 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'll just end at that particular point because most of us are students. I'm hoping. Are most of the students over here? Okay. A lot of us are students, and this is something that I actually stress in a lot of my Friday sermons. That Tawheed is a worldview. The first step is obviously from a creedal perspective is the utterance of this testimony that makes you enter into Islam. You know, and we have degrees. We have in Islam the human being, insofar as he's a human, is ennobled. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have ennobled the son of Adam. So whether you're Muslim or non-Muslim, God has ennobled you by making you are the locus, literally, of His divine attributes. You are the only creation on the face of this earth that can be divine-like. Nothing can actually be divine, but divine-like. You can reflect the divine in yourself. And this is why the Prophet said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, and this is in the Judeo-Christian tradition as well, that man was created in the image of God. And that's what it means. And so I stress this unity of the Tawheedic message, because Tawheed needs to be something that goes beyond simply a recognition of the mind. If Tawheed doesn't have a transformative effect in your own life, and in the way you treat people, and the way you look at things, and in your worship, then you're not doing it right. There's something missing. And people in the olden times understood this particular point. And so, and I know that, read someone like Rumi. Read someone like Rumi's conception of Tawheed. It is not a rational conception. For him, it's a very much lived experience of life that he was able to achieve through constant exertion and through worship and through acknowledging his own weakness in the sight of God himself. And so I hope that sheds some light on this concept. Again, I apologize for not getting into all the rational proofs and for the oneness, but as Muslims, we're called to look at things that benefit us, and so something that doesn't benefit us on a practical, real life level, anyone can come in and talk about what Tawheed is, oneness, and God's essence and God's attributes and this and that, and people will yawn, people will go back and they're like, oh, okay, I can regurgitate this, but if they don't know what it means to actually how Tawheed is to be perceived and utilized in one's life, then they've lost the whole plot. And the plot of Islam is a transformative one that draws you nearer to God. And in the process of drawing nearer to God, you are able to better benefit those around you. You're able to benefit yourself, and you're able to benefit them in a manner that's effective, and that's pure, and that's sincere, and that's calculated, and so forth. And so I hope that